Probably everyone's favorite gospel is John. It's 92% unique. 92% of John isn't in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So what tends to happen is people read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they get used to the same outline, which is they share the same basic outline. And then you get to John, and everything's new. There's people, you're meeting people you've never met before. And so when we have our biblical imagination conferences, when we focus on John, we focus on the uniqueness of John. 92% unique. That to me is still amazing. If it was 20% or 30% unique, you would think, maybe that's just a coincidence. But 92%, John is purposely leaving things out. He leaves major things out, like the Lord's Supper. He leaves the Lord's Supper out. But he always substitutes something that Matthew, Mark, and Luke can't bring themselves to tell you. And in the case of the Lord's Supper, John substitutes the foot washing. Only John can bring himself to tell you that story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all know that story. They can't bring themselves to tell you that story because it was so humiliating. But John can. Why? Because John is writing around 90, much later. Peter's been dead for 30 years when John writes his gospel. And so John is going to focus on things that the other gospel writers don't focus on, because he's been preaching these things for decades, and they come together. John's a very elegant gospel. Mark is less elegant, and Mark is still perfect. It's still God's Word, but you can see how Mark is written early, the testimony of Peter, and now John, who has preached these things for decades, writes his gospel. And Jesus is the Word, and Jesus is the light, and Jesus is the bread, and Jesus' life is really told as a parable, which is a very elegant part of John's gospel. But the newest thing that I've seen in John's gospel, again, the other gospels don't do this. John is the gospel that shows you Jesus talking to one person for a long time. No one else does that. And once you start thinking about it, you can think of the stories. Jesus and Nicodemus, right? They have this long discussion. Jesus and the woman at the well, that's only in John. Jesus and the man born blind. Jesus and the man who was lame for 38 years. Jesus focuses on and spends a lot and looks for these people and finds them in crowds. And it's interesting to me that John, looking back all those decades, remembers that about Jesus, that Jesus was this person who found time to listen to and to talk to just one person.